My name is Alex Rogers. I'm the Science Director of Ocean Census, and I'm going to talk to you today about adaptations to the deep sea. So what is the deep sea? Well, essentially it is the entire ocean that's deeper than about 200 meters, which makes it actually the biggest habitat for life on Earth. It contains more than 90% of life on planet Earth. Overall, the ocean is comprised of about 1.3 billion cubic kilometers of water, most of which is deep ocean. The deep sea is actually divided into different zones. So if we're thinking about the water column, then the zone between 200 to 1,000 meters is called the mesopelagic zone or twilight zone. Then we have the bathypelagic zone between about 1,000 meters and 3,000 meters, and the abyssopelagic between 3,000 meters and 6,000 meters, and finally the deepest part of the water column, which is confined to the ocean trenches, between 6,000 and nearly 11,000 meters. By the same token, the sea floor is also zoned as well. So we have the bathyal zone, which goes from about 200 meters, or the edge of the continental shelf, down to about 3,000 meters again. Then the abyssal zone from 3,000 meters to 6,000 meters depth. And finally the hadal zone, which is the ocean trenches from about 6,000 meters to nearly 11,000 meters. So just to point out that if you look in the literature, sometimes the definitions of these zones does differ in terms of the actual depths which are attributed to them. But in general, these are the terms that people use. Life in the deep ocean, of course, comprises of the animals which live on the seafloor, but also the animals which live in the water column. The animals on the seafloor, we essentially divide by size. So the biggest of these animals, the megafauna, are animals which we can see on cameras or videos when we're surveying the deep sea floor using towed equipment or remotely operated vehicles or submersibles. Then the next size down are the macrofauna. These are animals which are roughly 2 centimeters in size down to about 300 microns. And they include animals like small worms, mollusks, snails, bivalves, and small crustaceans as well. Then we have the smallest of the size classes of metazoan animals that we generally treat as animals rather than microbial taxa. And these are the myofauna from a size of about 300 microns to about 65 microns in size. These are the animals that actually live more or less between the grains of sediment on the seafloor. And they include groups like the nematode worms and more unusual groups like the loriciferans. The pelagic fauna is also divided by size, but we also tend to divide it by the zone in which it lives. So animals which live in the epipelagic zone are called epipelagic fauna. They're things like the fish that we're all familiar with, mackerel, tuna, those sorts of animals. Then we have animals which live in the twilight zone, which are really characterized by adaptations to life with some sunlight, but with low light levels. And these animals have all sorts of amazing adaptations in terms of their visual systems, adaptations in the morphology of the eye, the sensitivity of the eye, the specific wavelengths of light they can perceive, and so on. They have adaptations in terms of the coloration of their body, a whole range of adaptations to life, which allows them to act as predators or to avoid being eaten in this depth zone. And then we go into the dark ocean in the bathypelagic and abyssopelagic zone, where animals are adapted to life in the complete darkness and generally very low temperatures. And finally, the animals which live in the most extreme water column environment in the hadopelagic. These animals are also divided into the nekton, the animals which can swim powerfully and move against currents and waves and so on. Then what we call micronekton. These are the animals which have some powers of locomotion. They are things like lanternfish, these very small fish which live in the twilight zone, small shrimps and some of the gelatinous zooplankton, also animals like squid. And then the plankton, the animals which have almost no power of locomotion when faced with ocean currents and things. So what are the challenges of living in the deep sea? Well, surprisingly, one of the biggest challenges is a lack of food. Most of the food in the deep ocean comes from the surface. As that food sinks, it's consumed by both animals and microbes, bacteria. And so as you get deeper and deeper into the ocean, there is less and less food. There is limited or no light, depending on the depth at which you live. High pressure, up to nearly or up to more than 1,000 atmospheres of pressure, if you can even imagine what that's like in the deepest parts of the ocean. There is also extreme cold. Much of the water that supplies the abyssal plains, for example, is essentially polar in origin. So that water is just a couple of degrees above freezing almost wherever you are in the deep sea. In some special environments, there is the opposite problem, such as at hydrothermal vents, where very high temperatures may be encountered. But that we will leave for another lecture in this series. We're just talking about the general deep sea today. Extreme low oxygen can also be a feature of some special environments in the deep ocean, as can the presence of toxic chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide and heavy metals. So what are the effects of food limitation? Well, one of the main effects is that what we see in deep sea communities is a decrease in biomass and abundance of animals with depth. There is also, for many types of organisms, a decrease in individual size. So animals get smaller as they get deeper, essentially because there's less and less food. There is also, in many animals, a decline in metabolic rate with depth. This is thought to be a result of the fact that in shallow waters in the ocean, there is lots of visual predation. So you can imagine animals like tuna and sharks, which can see other animals from a distance and chase them. You need to be able to swim fast, whether it's to catch your prey or avoid predation. But in the deep sea, where visual predation is not possible, then you don't have to have such a high rate of metabolism. And in fact, for many groups of organisms, metabolic rates decline as you get deeper in the ocean. There's a very fascinating difference between bony fish and sharks when it comes to adapting to the deep sea. Sharks, for their buoyancy, use a special fat or oil called squalene. Squalene is very expensive to manufacture, and this means that at depths of between 3,000 to 4,000 meters, sharks basically reach the limit of their physiological ability to adapt to low food supply. So essentially, because there's not that much food in the deep sea, sharks simply cannot acquire enough energy to manufacture squalene, and therefore they can't maintain neutral buoyancy at those depths. Bony fish, however, use the swim bladder for neutral buoyancy, but also some of them use a type of fat called triglycerides, and these are much cheaper to manufacture than squalene, and therefore bony fish can live down to depths of 7,000 or 8,000 meters in the deep ocean. So if you're thinking about movies like The Meg, where a giant shark is coming from the great depths of the ocean, it's just not possible because sharks just cannot maintain the energy to manufacture squalene at those depths. Interestingly, there is also a shift in types of feeding in some groups of animals. So some groups shift from suspension feeding to becoming carnivores. So in this slide, you'll see examples of some of the adaptations to low food supply in the deep sea. We've got two groups of animals here, the sea squirts, the animal which you can see on your left, and a sponge. Now, most sea squirts and sponges feed on suspended particles in the water. The ones illustrated here from the deep sea are both carnivores, and you can see this sea squirt looks like a giant baseball glove, and it basically captures animals in that glove-like structure and eats them. The carnivorous sponge has specially adapted spicules on those globes you can see to actually trap the legs of crustaceans which it feeds on. The black devilfish, which you can see illustrated here as well, is also a fabulous example of adaptations to life with a low food supply. You can see that this fish is almost all mouth and all stomach. And that is an adaptation to be able to trap and eat almost anything it comes across. It has these huge teeth in comparison to its size to trap any animal it manages to attract. You can see this rather odd structure on the head. This is like a lure from a fishing rod that glows in the dark and actually attracts other animals in, and the devilfish will actually trap those in this very cavernous mouth. And for its size, again, it has a huge stomach, so it can really take in large meals. The fish looks really huge from the picture, but in fact, the biggest ones I've seen have only been about 10, 12 centimeters in length. So again, another adaptation to low food is small size. Animals in the deep sea are adapted all the way down to the molecular level to life at high pressure. And one of the things that increasing pressure and actually also decreasing temperature do is they actually reduce the fluidity of cell membranes. And animals in these conditions have to have molecular adaptations which increase the fluidity of cell membranes. And we can actually look at some of these deep sea animals and see that they've adapted their membranes to operate at high pressures through looking at the enzyme systems associated with cell membranes. One example here is from a membrane-associated protein. It's sodium potassium ATPase transport protein or enzyme, and we can actually see that the activity of this enzyme is maintained at a higher level at increasing pressure in animals from deeper water. Proteins are severely affected by increased pressure, and that's because increased pressure affects the volume of the protein, and of course if the volume changes, then the function of the protein is altered. It affects enzymes, multi-subunit proteins, membrane-based transport proteins, and also ligand binding. There is evidence from experimental studies that the enzymes of deep-sea fish are actually more rigid than those from shallower waters. A great example of this are certain types of hagfish, where essentially the activity of specific enzymes, and in this case the enzyme is lactate dehydrogenase, is actually maintained at higher pressures for the deeper water species. And it's found that this function is maintained by, again, increased rigidity in the protein, and that increased rigidity is basically allowed by just 6 amino acid substitutions in the lactate dehydrogenase molecule. So this enables the molecule to maintain function at high pressure. Another fascinating adaptation is the use of what are called organic osmolytes as kind of molecular chaperones or molecular protectants. These osmolytes are used in marine invertebrates and sharks and rays to maintain osmotic balance in seawater, but to do that without using salt, because that causes all sorts of other physiological problems with the animals. These types of molecules include a range of different chemicals, things like sugars, polyols, methylamines, but a particularly important one is trimethylamine oxide, or TMAO. If you look at the concentration of TMAO in different fish as they come from different depths of the ocean, and other animals as well, like shrimp, you find that the concentration of TMAO increases in the tissues as the animals come from greater and greater water depths. And what's happening is that the TMAO is produced in increasing concentrations because it actually helps to maintain the 3D structure of proteins. And this is why we call it a molecular protectant, because it actually protects other molecules and allows them to continue functioning in a high pressure environment. Interestingly, TMAO also occurs in high concentrations in animals from very cold environments, such as Antarctica. So to summarize this short lecture, I would just like to say that the deep sea environment is clearly physiologically a very challenging environment. We have very little food, low temperature, it's dark, and very, very high pressures. We see adaptations to animals through a whole range of aspects of their physiology, from their size, their metabolic rate, their lifestyle, their body shape, and all the way down to the molecular level. And this is why these animals can't be dragged up from the depths of the ocean to the surface without, in many cases, dying. Their bodies are so well adapted to life at high pressure that for them it's a completely normal environment, and what's extreme for them is actually being brought up to the surface in an environment where the pressure is much lower. A fascinating thing which we may come back to in other talks in this lecture series is the fact that some of the adaptations we see to life in the deep sea, we also see in adaptations to life in other extreme environments.